Good morning. Welcome. We're so glad you're here this morning for this very wonderful panel on pioneers of Catholic literature, women writers of the 20th century. I'm going to introduce each speaker, and then they'll give their paper, and then hopefully we'll have time for some questions afterwards. My name is Maire Mullins, and I'm from Pepperdine University. And it is my great pleasure and honor to introduce you to Dorian Speed, who is a writer and educator in Houston, and who recently graduated from the University of St. Thomas with her MFA in creative writing. She's a fellow in the 2023 NEH Flannery O'Connor Institute, and she spoke most recently on bad mentors and terrible teachers in Flannery O'Connor's work at the 2024 GCSU conference. She contributed a chapter about Muriel Spark to Women of the Catholic Imagination and worked in the Muriel Spark archives at the University of Tulsa this summer. Dorian is currently writing her first novel, as well as a book comparing the lives and work of O'Connor and Spark. Please help me welcome Dorian Speed.
Good morning, and thank you everyone for coming this morning. I know you had many choices of panels to attend this morning, and we all appreciate you being here with us. Thank you to Maire for the introduction. As she said, I am in the early stages of working on a book comparing O'Connor and Spark. So this morning I'm going to talk a little bit about what made Spark unique, some things that I found in the archives at the University of Tulsa that I thought would be fun to share. And then if I have time, a little bit about where I hope that project is heading. So here's the apology. This is evidently Ladies' Week in Fiction, but please don't run away. This is one of the things I most enjoyed in my work in the archives was finding the incredibly sexist and egregious remarks made about Spark by reviewers, because if you know much about Muriel Spark, you know that if you crossed her, you were liable to end up in a story, possibly the victim of random violence. So I'm not sure where Phyllis showed up, but I'm sure that perhaps we could find her somewhere. This is another one. I'm sorry, I don't have the source. The source right now is my text message to Katie Carl from the archives listing ridiculous quotes. But the author of this remarkable novel is an egregious personality, plumpish, fair-haired, and 40-ish. She looks like Hermione Baddeley, not at all like a lady novelist. So, lady novelist in the audience, we're getting t-shirts, and I don't know what a lady novelist is supposed to look like, but. So the title of this talk is Muriel Spark, Transformative Satire. So I wanted to speak a little bit about how she as a writer was transformative, and also how the experience of being a writer transformed her own life. So I will now let her introduce herself. Born in Ice Cave of Southern Tyrol, year 609 BC of Centaur stock, mother-descended Venus, Muriel Spark rose from the waves, as is well known, demands fabulous fees. And this is for the publication of The Comforters. If you're familiar with The Comforters, the protagonist is a recent convert to Catholicism, and this was inspired by the comforters in the book of Job. They're incredibly ineffective advice to Job, being echoed in the ridiculous personalities that Spark's character encounters as she goes through various adventures involving murder and diamonds. And anyway, so one of the first ways in which Spark is transformative is this. If you find yourself in a Spark story, you should watch out because a random act of violence is likely to occur to you or someone whom you are standing next to. So the violence in Spark's stories is very efficient, just like everything about her writing. She's incredibly precise, and the violence that she incorporates is is in keeping with her idea of our pretenses to determining our own fate and our ultimate sovereignty to the will of God. So the book of Job was very formative in her conversion. She spoke about it extensively. There's a great YouTube video where she's talking with Nigel Lawson and Christopher Hitchens, and she's picked the book of Job as the book that she wants them to discuss. And she was very taken with the poet. She started out as a poet. She was awarded Queen of Poetry when she was in grade school. And she saw a novel as like an extended poem. And I think you can see that in the efficiency of her language and the precision with which she portrays things. But the idea of our complete subjectivity to the will of God is something that pervades her fiction and that animates, I think, a lot of what she's trying to do in terms of her spirituality. I would not characterize her as a social novelist who's trying to take on particular issues of the day. Her work is more confronting the spiritual reality of our ultimate dependence on God and all the ways in which we delude ourselves into thinking that we are the masters of our fate. In regards to this violence, I loved finding this bit of feedback from Derek Stanford. Derek Stanford worked with Spark in editing a critical biography of Emily Bronte, and as editor of, working with her when she was the editor of the Poetry Review. They were romantically involved, and it was during that time that she converted to Catholicism. He then wrote, I think in 1963, he chose to write a critical biography of her, and she said, if he had asked me, I would tell him not to do that. So he later ends up being satirized in one of her later books. But I liked this. I think it's a far cry from Kensington that he shows up in. So I love this quote: "Chaps are very rough to girls in these stories." So this is in response to her first collection of stories, The Go-Away Bird and Other Stories. And it was, so he's given her extensive feedback, which of course she completely disregarded because she pretty much, I was talking to someone last night and he said, is it true that she never revised? Well, if you visited the archives at Tulsa, which you should, and go see Jennifer Frey in her office, it has all of the notebooks of her manuscripts. So she always used the same grade school composition books. She would order them, special order from the same publisher, pretty much for most of her life. You can see her handwritten notebooks, and there's a few crossouts, but then she would basically deliver the manuscript, and that was it. Even from the start of her publishing career, she was very determined, and had a very strong and singular vision, and she was able to, she's in an interview, she's asked by someone, how do you find the writing process? Is it challenging? Is it, do you find moments of depression, or is it easy? And she said, oh no, it comes quite easily to me. And I thought, well, that's great for you, Muriel. I'm really happy. The first work that launched her as a fiction writer instead of writing literary criticism was her story, The Seraph and the Zambezi. So it's in that first collection, The Go-Away Bird. In it, she's taking on a sort of secular, strange Christmas pageant, and this was written based on her time in Rhodesia during her her only marriage, She left Scotland, was living in colonial Rhodesia, and has several stories inspired by that, a lot of which deal with race and the incredibly, restrictive and bigoted atmosphere in which she lived. So in this story, there's a supernatural angle. A seraph appears in the middle of the Christmas pageant, and at the end of the story, we see the seraph walking away along Victoria Falls. And she said that was inspired by a real trip that she took with her husband at the time. And after that trip, she said she knew the marriage was over. He had severe mental health issues. He was very abusive. When she became pregnant with their son, he asked her to get an abortion. She refused. She later escaped Rhodesia on a troop transport back to England, but had to leave her son behind because her husband had custody. Eventually, she is able to bring her son back to Europe, and her son was basically raised by her parents in Edinburgh while she's in London working and writing. So you can see her beautiful handwriting and very few crossouts, and that's pretty much when you look at a Muriel Spark manuscript. She does say that she had to borrow typing paper from a writing store down the street because she had no money, and she knew she wanted to enter this contest. And winning the contest was what sort of launched her into fame. During this time when she was living in poverty, she became addicted to Dexedrine because she was trying to save money on food, and also because she was always, throughout her life, very concerned about her weight. So she developed this addiction. Derek Stanford, who gave her the chaps are rude to girls in these stories feedback, kind of conducted an intervention, I guess, and got Evelyn Waugh and Graham Greene to help pay for her to go to what I guess we would call rehab now. But as she was having that experience, she was editing a volume of T.S. Eliot's a volume of criticism of T.S. Eliot, and she was hallucinating that he was sending her coded message in the text. And this shows up in her novel, The Comforters, where the main character hears a typewriter typing out her thoughts as she's having them and narrating everything that's happening. So she was always very interested in kind of doing whatever she wanted with what she was writing, and taking things like this fantastic conceit. There's a lot of supernatural things that are just presented as very matter of fact, especially in her early work. But when Waugh read that novel, he said that he had been working on a similar idea and that she had executed it much better than he had. So he and Eliot and Greene were great promoters of her work early on. Okay. The next way in which she transformed fiction, and let us consider this the blank slate of the reality about to come. Her fiction is very well known for being completely out of order. She often gives away the ending at the beginning, and she has said that she feels that creates more suspense because you already know what's happening, but you don't know how it's going to happen. So if you're familiar with her most famous work, The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie, I'll read through this quickly, but I thought this was hilarious. This is a little illustrative of this technique takeoff on her, on Miss Jean Brodie. Miss Lockhart has suggested I apply for another post, Miss Brodie said, goose-stepping her way into the classroom. But the headmistress shall not get rid of me, for I am in my prime. You are my mini-me's. The Brodie set smiled. Rose, who was famous for sex, though it was never made clear what she had done to earn this notoriety, thought back to when Miss Brodie had told them she once had a lover who had been felled in Flanders. Can you have sex if you are in your prime? Asked Rose, who was to become famous for sex 6 years later. If you're familiar with Brodie, this is exactly how the novel is written. Miss Brodie seems to have been in her prime for a long time, replied Sandy, who was famous even then for her piggy eyes. That is one of the book's comic conceits, said Monica, who was famous for math. So we should all say the word prime as often as possible. There are so many comic conceits going on here, said Eunice, who was famous for gymnastics and hadn't even noticed all the arch time shifts, that it's becoming a bit labored. I'd better do a somersault before I get married to a doctor in 10 years' time. This is my favorite. I'd better say pride too, I suppose, said Maire, who was famous for being a silent lump, as I'm about to get burned to death at a hotel hellfire of Calvinist indecision in 14 years' time. It's cut off the credits, but I'll be sure to tell you what they are because I don't remember without looking at this slide. Okay. This is very much in keeping with her style and her complete, freedom to innovate and not work within a tradition, but sort of invent her own of the time shifts and the manipulation of the events. And then the third way in which I would say she was transformative is she was able to transform very mundane details that she observed. She described herself as a great noticer into sparks of inspiration for her characters. So she, in the book Loitering with Intent, where Fleur Talbot is basically Spark, writing as herself. She talks about being in a job interview and observing tiny details about the way that the person interviewing her is holding his hands on his desk and this other person, and noticing all of these details, and from that taking it and transforming it into characters. So I love this quote. When people say that nothing happens in their lives, I believe them. But you must understand that everything happens to an artist. Time is always redeemed, nothing is lost, and wonders never cease. So in my last few minutes, I won't read these, but she eventually is transformed to the point that no one messes with Muriel Spark. And not only does she not accept art edits, but her dear friend with whom she lived most of the end of her life in Tuscany, and who was her literary executor, sort of represented her to the world and gave her space to write and privacy in which to do so. And I do love the attempt to banalize her prose. And she means every word she writes and every comma that she puts in. So fellow writers, let us maybe consider this advice, although I feel like many people could probably benefit from the excision of some commas and some words. Okay, and then this is the best part. If you've read The Girls of Slender Means, it was serialized in the Evening Standard over September 16th to the 27th in 1963. So this is very early in her career, but she's already at a point where she's achieved incredible fame based on the prime of Miss Jean Brodie. I apologize for the slight nudity in this slide, but we're artists as Catholics. So, and this was in the newspaper. And I just wanted everybody to see what I love this so much. So if you're familiar with the story of the Girls of Slender, I'm not going to tell you what this is. If you're not, you just need to read the book. It's interesting to see her transformation from so impoverished that she has to borrow typing paper to, the cause célèbre of the London scene. And then she decides to leave and go to New York to find more space to write where she's not so famous. Who hasn't been there? This I love. So 20 years after the publication of The Seraph and the Zambezi, she has this interview with Philip Toynbee in which he says, "You've got a marvelous flat, a lot of gorgeous clothes, a vigorous social life, quite a change from Grub Street and the dumpy bohemian girl I then knew. Now you're slender, almost svelte, a sensational transformation, though I detect a waifish element in you still." And rather than knocking his block off for saying she was a dumpy bohemian, she says, "A transformation I've thoroughly enjoyed, but I'm not all that rich, and anyway, I give away a third of my income." Anyway, this is a great interview between the two, looking back at her career at the publication of Memento Mori. And, that's what I was going to say. We're going to have dumpy bohemian shirts also available on the Muriel Spark Etsy store. So in closing, just quickly with comparing O'Connor and Spark, this was very interesting to me. I was really hoping to find, and I haven't yet, evidence that the two corresponded. I just think it would be so interesting to see what they thought of each other. All I've found is some evidence that that O'Connor read Spark. She liked Memento Mori, The Girls of Slender Means, and then, of course, O'Connor's life comes to an end, and Spark continues and gets to blog for slate.com at the end of her life and have a fantastic trajectory. So I think it's interesting to see these two extremely visionary writers who very much stick to their own understanding of what their fiction is going to be. And I think there's a lot of interesting points of comparison there. So in closing, I encourage you, if you're not familiar with Dame Muriel, to check out one of her many, many works, and there are interviews with her on YouTube that are really quite charming and delightful. And thank you again for coming to our presentations this morning.
Thank you, Dorian. Our second speaker today is Amy Fahey, who is a teaching fellow at the Thomas More College of Liberal Arts in Merrimack, New Hampshire. Dr. Fahey has written and lectured on Norse literature, the Eddas and Sagas, Chaucer, Shakespeare, Sigrid Undset, Willa Cather, Flannery O'Connor, and other medieval and modern writers. Her work has appeared in the Catholic Herald, the St. Austin Review, The Catholic Thing, Crisis Magazine, Columbia Magazine, and elsewhere. Her chapter, Sigrid Undset, Novelist of Mercy, appears in Women of the Catholic Imagination from Word on Fire, 2024. She holds a BA in English Literature from Hillsdale College, an M. Philosophy in Medieval Literature from the University of St. Andrews, and an MA and PhD in English and American Literature from Washington University in St. Louis, where she served as a 4-year Olin Fellow. Her paper today is titled, Sigrid Undset, Novelist of Mercy. Please help me welcome Amy Fahey.
So I'm having, can you hear me okay? Having PowerPoint envy. I don't have a PowerPoint. So even though this paper is titled the same as the chapter, they're completely different. So, what I'm about to say is also completely different from what I published on Sigrid Undset in First Things this morning. So I realized when I was asked to give this talk that it fell when I was assigned to give it this morning. I was so grateful. Today is actually the 100th anniversary of Sigrid Undset's conversion to Catholicism. She entered the church on the Feast of All Saints, which, given her the role that the saints played in her own conversion process, is a beautiful, not a coincidence, a beautiful serendipitous and providential conversion that today is that anniversary. So I don't know how many of you have read Kristin Lavransdatter, but I first read it as a young mother in bed with a fever. And I, at the time, was suffering from mastitis, which is an infection that's shared by cows and mothers. I was pleased recently to read that Dale Hudson also read Kristin Lavransdatter for the first time when he had a fever, obviously not suffering from the same disease. And it occurred to me that if only every American had had a copy of Kristin Lavransdatter on their nightstand during COVID, the world would be a much better place. Tim Page, who brought out the newer edition of his translation of her early novel, Jenny, says, if Sigrid Undset means anything to a reader at all, it is likely that she means a great deal. And that's a kind of Norse understatement. Reading Kristin Lavransdatter is a commitment. And for those who have made the commitment, it's one that pays off. For those who haven't, and I've probably met more people who've said, oh yeah, I tried to read that novel. Oh yeah, I started it several times. I threw it across the room at a certain point. I was so frustrated with Kristin. So part of my goal in this talk is to have you pick it up again if you have not read it. And why should you read it? Well, men have remarked on how well she gets men. David Warren says, I've never read a novel in which I could see men so clearly through a woman's searching eyes. Gore Allen remarks on her, quote, outstanding ability to think, speak, and reason like a man. She also gets women, and in particular mothers and motherhood. There have been many recent pieces in First Things and Elsewhere on her rich presentation of motherhood that's unsurpassed in any other work of fiction, arguably. She gets priests. Two of the book-length studies of Sigrid Undset come from the late Hungarian physicist Father Stanley Jaki, who wrote a book on Sigrid Undset late in his life, and more recently the Dominican Father Aidan Nichols. And something that I don't think has been adequately explored is how well she gets children. So I love the Little House on the Prairie books, but I think, especially early on in Kristin Lavransdatter, her understanding of how children pick up on things, how they learn, how they absorb from their environment, and how that it plants seeds that are picked up elsewhere is stunning to me. Her capacity for understanding the human person and her rich characterization is in itself alone enough reason enough to read the work. She also has tremendous descriptive powers, particularly her description of nature and the way that nature functions in Kristin Lavransdatter. And this she shares, I think, with her fellow novelist and dear friend Willa Cather. One thing, this is not going to be purely hagiography, but here's the moment where I'll say, if I had to say anything in way of criticism, it's that I'm not so sure she entirely gets point of view. Point of view is very difficult. Most of what we get in Kristin Lavransdatter is obviously Kristin's point of view. It's a kind of Jamesian notion of character and consciousness, but in a work of 1,000 pages, I'm gonna forgive her that one. When I first read it, I read it with a background in medieval literature. My mother-in-law was a book buyer at Emory University, and she thought, oh, this is set in the Middle Ages. I think my daughter-in-law might like it. And I quickly picked up on her saturation in medieval literature that comes out in every page of the novel. And all the references, the obvious works, the Romance tradition, her description of the Abbess Fru Groa, which is obviously indebted to Hildegard of Bingen, her when she talks about the nuns in the convent and the way they eat daintily, it's like Chaucer's Prioress. When Gunulf has his beautiful meditation on the cross, it's clearly indebted to the Anglo-Saxon dream of the rood. So I was struck by how she combined that with what we might consider, or we might call an unsentimental realism, which I assumed was borrowed from a kind of 20th century naturalism, that she was nicely combining these medieval and modern elements. But the more I read of Undset and about her, I realized that unsentimental realism wasn't a modernist move, but was rooted in her cultural and literary heritage. And what do I mean by that? Well, there was a whole realm of literary works, both pagan and Christian, which drew relative blanks for me at the time, but which were formative and, I would say, cataclysmic for Sigrid Undset. And so I started reading those sources, and I became enchanted with them. And I did what I usually do when I really want to read something, but the demands of motherhood and homeschooling and various other things don't allow me to. I designed a course. And I have been teaching this course for over a decade now. It's called Northern Literature, and I'm teaching it this semester. So we've made our way through the Eddas and the sagas. We read some other modern fiction, George Mackay Brown's Magnus, and we spend a good chunk of the semester on Kristin Lavransdatter, and I frame that course as attempting to answer a question that Elquin asks of the abbot of Lindisfarne. Quid enim Hingeldis cum Christo? What does Ingeld have to do with Christ? Now, he asks it in the sense of, why are you guys reading lays when you should be reading from Scripture and praying? But I think Sigrid Undset didn't obviously set out to answer that question, but her fiction answers it, and then some. And so what I want to do, as if it isn't enough of a challenge to talk to you in 20 minutes about a 1,000-page novel, I'm going to actually get to that by talking about the works that influenced her the most and introducing you perhaps to those works. And I want to mention at the outset the work that influenced her by far the most, and that is Njal Saga, also called Brennu Njal. So Muriel Spark isn't the only one with giveaways. It's burnt Njal because in the end, Njal gets burnt alive in his home. So the very title gives that away. You know, I have to say that I think Sigrid Undset is a neglected writer, but Njal Saga is perhaps one of the most neglected, if not the most neglected work in the Western canon, if we still have such a thing. Mortimer Adler sort of lists it in his reading list, and several other people do. I'm not actually sure they ever read it. And if they did, it didn't seem to have much of an effect on them. But it certainly had an effect on Undset. She taught herself Old Icelandic to read it at the ripe age of 10, and she describes the experience as an earthquake. And when I first read Njal Saga, I felt like some watcher in the skies when a new planet swims into his ken. You know, it's a really amazing work. And I can see on every page of Kristin Lavransdatter its influence. The second earthquake that she had, and she describes this as an earthquake as well, is her reading of the ballad tradition, of the Danish ballads in particular. She wasn't a huge fan of the Norse ballads. They're mostly historical, a little bit dry, but the Danish ballads really had a lot of spirit. And I, again, have an affinity with that. At the college where I teach, all of the students in the writing class have to compose a ballad, and we read a number of the older ballads in preparation for that. And I was pleased in looking at some correspondence of Sigrid Undset that she spent her first literary stipend on purchasing a copy of Francis Child's 5-volume, The English and Scottish Popular Ballads, which I also love and own. So the third influence on her are the lives and legends of the Northern Saints, of all saints. You know, her final work was a biography of Cather and Siena. But if you've ever seen, Clooney has done a tremendous job in republishing much of Sigrid Undset's work that's out of print. And one of them, the works that they've brought back into print, is her Saga of Saints. That includes her lives of all the great Northern Saints, St. Magnus, St. Sunniva, St. Halvard, and her bestie, St. Olaf. So I just want to have a little pause here and say, of course you can read Kristin Lavransdatter without knowing any of this, but I feel like we as Catholics, if we're not reading these works, who's going to? And it sheds, you know, Dana Joya talked last night about beauty, and I have to say that the novel's beauty wasn't really opened up to me until I read those works and until I saw the profound and rich and intricate way in which she was using those works, not using, that's not the right word, she was engaging with those works in her fiction. So I'd love to introduce you more to her heavenly friends, but I don't have time here. But I'd like to introduce you very briefly to some of her textual friends and the way in which that opens up for us the novel. And I don't think I'm going to have time to do all of what I had hoped to do, but I particularly want to get at that through one emblem that has many references at a certain point early on in the novel, and that is the cloak. And so I want to point to a couple of ways in which that early Norse literature adopts that emblem of the cloak in various ways, and what Sigrid Undset is doing with it in Kristin Lavransdatter. That kind of opens up for us our understanding of what happens in the remaining 800 or so pages of the novel. So I'm going to concentrate on an early portion of the novel, so no big spoiler alerts. The cloak is obviously something that you would expect to find in Northern literature for the obvious practical reasons. Right? Most people wear cloaks as a means of warmth and protection. But the thematic role that it almost always plays in Northern literature, in pagan literature in particular, takes on a more sinister dimension. The cloak is the locus of secrecy, of hiddenness, of deceit, of mistrust. And if ever there was a culture of suspicion, it was the pagan North. The Havamal, which is the wisdom of Odin from the Edda, begins when someone enters a home. Havest thy eyes about thee when thou enterest. Be wary always. Be watchful always. For one never knoweth when need will be to meet hidden foe in the hall. So the Norse are known for their hospitality. They always have been. And one of Sigrid Undset was just so deeply wounded by when the Nazis invaded Norway in World War II, a surprise invasion. All of the Norwegians recalled how the summer before there were German backpackers coming through that they were giving food and lodging to, and she realized then, oh, they were, preparing for the invasion. What a breach of hospitality that was. But the early impetus for this hospitality is a kind of protective measure, clearly, because you never know what one is hiding under his cloak. And her favorite ballad was a Danish ballad called Abby Skammelsen. She had a painting of called Ebbe in the Wedding Yard by her dear friend Agnes Stoltmaler, and it hung above her bed in Birkebeck. And it's the classic medieval cloak and dagger ballad. It introduces us to the violent consequences of illicit love and betrayal. It was Ebbe Skammelsen that drew his brand so brown. It was haughty Aedelus that he to earth struck down. Aedelus was his betrothed. He went over to earn his fortune. While he was gone, his brother Peter stole his bride. She was more than happy to comply. His parents were in on the deceit, and he shows up right on their wedding night to all of this treachery. Oh, he has hidden the bloody brand beneath his cloak so pall. He sought his brother Sir Peter that sat in the stone-built hall. It was Ebbe Skammelsen that drew his brand so brown. It was his Peter his brother, that he to earth struck down. Oh, he has wounded his father sore and struck off his mother's hand. And so must he roam, Ebbe Skammelsen, the wild ways of the land. Now, in the novel, ballads take a really large role. And there's a kind of undercurrent. So Lavran says, I think when people want to contemplate doing something bad, they write a ballad about it, and then they're not tempted anymore. Wouldn't that be nice? and Kristin knows, she says after she's, had her illicit relationship with Erlend, perhaps this was the ill thing that was spoken of in all the songs. She knows that she's playing a role in that. So in Njal Saga 2, one of the main spurs to action is because of the false and deceit, slander, and there's a cloak. Flosie's cloak is given as a gift to Hoskuld, who's Njal's foster son. And Hoskuld is wearing this cloak when he's innocently murdered while sowing his grain. And his wife Hildegun folds the bloody cloak up carefully and places it in his chest. And we know with Chekhovian precision that we're going to see that cloak again. And so when the time comes and she wants to goad Flosi on to seek vengeance for Hoskuld's death, she pulls out the cloak and puts it over his shoulders. Hildegun went out and opened up her chest. She took it from the cloak which Flosi had given Hoskuld, and in which Hoskuld was slain. She walked silently up to Flosi. Flosi had finished eating, and the table had been cleared. Hildegun placed the cloak on Flosi's shoulders. The dried blood poured down all over him. So the cloak then operates in this Norse culture as something emblematic of this cycle of mistrust and violence. But there's something in Njal Saga that happens that hints that there might be a better interpretation of the cloak, or it might occupy a different space. And that is something that has perplexed modern scholars of Njal Saga to this day. In the middle of the saga is this 5-chapter recounting of Iceland's conversion to Christianity. And this pagan Godi Thangbrand puts on his cloak and he lies down and he spends the whole day in silence. And then he comes out of the cloak and he says, okay, we're all going to become Christian. And so, the modern editor of Njal Saga, the Penguin edition, says, he calls this episode intriguing. Did Hall bribe Torgeir? This is Godai. Did they agree beforehand that Christianity should be adopted? Did Torgeir lie under the cloak for an entire day simply in order to prepare his speech? These and further questions cannot be resolved here. But what is resolved in the minds of this editor and modern readers is that the conversion has no bearing on the saga, which Sigrid Undset understood not to be true. Now to the novel. Oh, dear. Oh, my goodness. Okay, not to the novel. So I'm going to quickly mention there are several moments where this cloak takes center stage. The first is in Kristin's near violation by Benteen. Benteen grabs her under her cloak and attempts to rape her. She's not raped, but she feels violated. So that shortly afterwards, when Erlend puts her under his cloak, she concedes to him. I wonder where I've left my cloak, whispered Kristin. Erlend put his arm around her waist and wrapped his cape around both of them. Walking together, they went into the herb garden. And then later, they're able to meet together because they use this cloak as a pretext. Oh, you have a cloak being made for you. So you go to Brunhild Fluga, who's, the go-between, and allowing them to come together. So there is this continued cycle of violence and deceit associated with the cloak. As Andrew Lytle said, the novel's matter is an inordinate passion, destructive of all laws and customs, which make for peace and ease of domestic tranquility. For their ecstasies of love, all pay dearly. Not only anguish, death is often the cost. But there's another subtext running through this, and this is what allows us out of this culture of suspicion. And that is the cloak as a locus of mercy and redemption, of God's hiddenness, of God revealing himself to man, so that what lies under the cloak is no longer something suspect and mistrustful, but something that provides a path out of that cycle of sin and violence. It's a cloak of mercy. And we see this in 3 occasions, and you'll have to read the novel to see them. But one of them is the presence, when she goes into Hamar Cathedral, of the Mater Misericordia. And this beautiful image of Our Lady opening up her cloak as a refuge for sinners. And with this image, Sigrid Undset understood that there was an opening, a space for something different. She said, Optimism does not come easily to one who has delved deeply into human nature, unless he can put his trust in something which is beyond the life he knows. And her trust in that mystical body of Christ, which reveals itself in this cloak of mercy, offers for us as moderns as well, I think, a way out of what I would only characterize as a re-emergence in a much more sinister vein of our zero trust culture. So I would urge, Sigrid had said that modern heathenism is a new thing, a declaration of war against a God who has spoken, where the old heathenism was a love song to a God who hid himself. So I would suggest it would be helpful to us, both as readers, as writers, and as Catholics, to acquaint ourselves with that love song. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. Our third speaker this morning is Amy Welborn. And she is the author of over 30 books for children, youth, and adults, published by Loyola Ignatius and Our Sunday Visitor. Amy has published essays in many publications, including Commonweal, Dappled Things, and Angelus News. She has an MA in Church History from Vanderbilt University, and her paper today is titled, To Have Felt Fire as Well as Seen It, The Limits of Willa Cather's Catholic Imagination. Please help me welcome Amy Welborn.
Thank you, and thank you all for being here. I echo Dorian's gratitude because there's a lot going on this morning, and we were both kind of irritated that there's panels that we can't go to because we have the privilege of presenting to you all. And I also want to, echo Dorian's appreciation of Muriel Spark and encourage you to read her if you haven't. I had read Memento Mori, and then I read The Girls of Slender Means, and I think that was the book that really blew my mind, and it really encouraged me to dive more deeply into Spark. But I'm here to talk about Willa Cather, and again, Dorian invited me to contribute something to this panel, and I kind of looked at all the potential Catholic female authors, and I thought, well, no, other people could do those better than I could. And I said, let's talk about Willa Cather. Because, of course, many people assume, based mostly on Death Comes for the Archbishop, but also on Shadows in the Rock, that Cather is Catholic. I was talking to a friend of mine who's got a PhD in humanities, not in literature, but in humanities, a couple weeks ago, and he goes, she wasn't Catholic? Really? No, Willa Cather was not Catholic. In a review of Death Comes for the Archbishop in Commonweal in 1927, Michael Williams wrote, Miss Cather is not a Catholic, yet certainly no Catholic American writer that I know of has ever written so many pages steeped in spiritual knowledge and understanding of Catholic motives, and so sympathetically illustrative of the wonder and beauty of Catholic mysteries as she has done in this book. And indeed, Death Comes for the Archbishop is regularly included in collections of great Catholic novels, great American Catholic novels. It is beloved not only for its sympathetic and wise treatment of Catholic life and figures, but also for what we might call its sacramental vision. The descriptions, beautiful, unmatched descriptions of outer and interior landscapes that evoke the deepest inner realities of truth, beauty, and love. And her deep engagement with her Catholic material in Death Comes for the Archbishop led many to assume that she was Catholic herself. But of course she wasn't. She wrote in a letter, you asked me after I sent you the Quebec story whether I was on the road to becoming Catholic. By no means. I do, however, admire the work of Catholic missionary priests on this continent. And in another letter, no, I am not a Catholic, and I do not think I shall become one. And as I mentioned, Death Comes for the Archbishop is not her only work that incorporates Catholic imagery, life, and themes and characters. Shadows on the Rock, which followed Death Comes for the Archbishop, centers on 17th century Montreal with very dominant and again, sympathetic treatment of Catholic life. And of course, Catholic characters are important in her prairie novels, in O Pioneers, the French in O Pioneers, the Bavarians in My Antonia. And Catholics also play a role in two of her mid-career works, I think in very intriguing ways, which I'm going to talk about later, My Mortal Enemy and The Professor's House. And her final unfinished novel, the material related to which she had destroyed, as well as many of her papers at her death by her own request, was going to be set in Avignon, during the Avignon papacy, and it was called Hard Punishments. And we have a few hints of what it was about. It was to be centered on two young men, two boys, both of who had suffered hard punishments. One had been hung by his thumbs for thievery, and the other had his tongue cut out for blasphemy. And their mutual relationship, and I think the ways that they assisted each other. So her work then can and clearly has been embraced and appreciated as embodying an expression of Catholic imagination. But what I explore in this paper are the limits of that Catholic imagination. What did she see in Catholicism? What about it appealed to her? How did she utilize it in her fiction? And most importantly, what's absent? It's my argument that what is absent in Cather's understanding and use of Catholicism is helpful in helping us talk about that knotty question of what is Catholic imagination. So we begin with her life. She was born in Virginia, moved to Nebraska, graduated from the University of Nebraska, lived and worked as a journalist in Pittsburgh and New York City, during which time she began to write short stories and then novels. In adulthood, her primary residence was New York City, but very important to her were other places, of course. Her home, the Plains, the American Southwest, Canada. She had a home in New Brunswick. Europe, especially France. France was very, very important to her, and New Hampshire, where she is buried. Her religious journey. Cather was famously a very private person about everything. She did not spill her guts in the letters that we have or anything like that. And that includes her sense of spirituality. This is what we know about her affiliation, is that she came from a Baptist background, Northern Baptist background. However, in 1922, in her late 40s, she was confirmed in the Episcopal Church in Red Cloud with her parents. They were confirmed at the same time. And she never talks about this. She never mentions it. She never describes her feelings or her motivations or anything like that. So it's fertile ground for scholars to wonder why. Why was she confirmed? And there are various theories related to, some say it was a social standing thing. It was maybe evidence of a inner spiritual conversion, because one of the kind of supportive points of that point of view is something she wrote in an introduction to a collection of her essays later, in which she said 1922 was the year the world broke apart. She used the year 1922 as kind of a dividing point between before and after. And she never really explained what that meant either, but again, the kind of understanding and the assumption is that Cather, as a person who was not, shall we say, entranced with modernity, and was criticized at the time by some of her contemporaries for it, as being, quote, old-fashioned, right, did see the world that existed before the Great War and before the tremendous and rapid technological changes of that post-war era as a world that was gone, and a world that she felt more at home in, and a world that she missed. And so, was her confirmation in the Episcopal Church connected to this? We don't know. The most kind of reasonable Occam's razor kind of explanation is that, well, the family had been involved in the Episcopal Church in Red Cloud. They knew the rector, they knew the bishop of the area. They supported the church financially. It was kind of the church they were attached to and that they did things with and for and worshiped in when they worshiped. And so it just made sense. It made sense. She was home for Christmas. She got confirmed with her parents. So other than that, we really don't know. In her correspondence that we have, and we don't have a lot of it, she mentions God. She mentions, I'll pray for you, please pray for me, and so on. But that's it. So why did this, why Catholicism for this Baptist, Episcopal, definitely Protestant writer? Where did it come from? How did it become her frequent subject matter and the subject matter of her most beloved work? Well, first, it was organic to her material. If there were Catholics, in the towns she was creating, in the world she was creating, she was going to describe them. They were going to be a part of her work. And this includes in Death Comes for the Archbishop. She said, I knew the Southwest early, and I knew it long and well. I did not write about it earlier for one reason only. The Southwest is so essentially and certainly at its root a Catholic country that it seemed to me no Protestant could handle the material properly. And then she basically says, I was waiting for Catholics to write about this, but no one ever got around to it. So I waited 15 years for some Roman Catholic to write a book about the New Mexicans, their religion and country, and some of those early French missionary priests who left such a fragrant tradition of tolerance and insight and kindly sympathy. So it was attached, if it was attached to material and themes that were important to her, of course she incorporated it. But more importantly, I think on a deeper level, Cather did indeed see religion as especially deeply rooted humanistic types of religion as integral to human experience, life, and civilization. She wrote to a letter in 1896, there is no God but one God, and art is his revealer. Religion in general was an expression of the highest and most grounded aspects of human life, the aspects that express the transcendent beauty and love. She wrote, I'm going to cut here for time. And so she absolutely sees the religious sentiment and religious intuition as essential to human life. So why then Catholicism? Skip this one. Because essentially Catholicism was the body and the entity that did this the best. Catholicism was the historical institution that preserved, maintained, and spread truth, beauty, love in the most powerful and sustained way through human history. She wrote, whatever else the Church of Rome has been or not been, it has never been afraid of evil. It has not stood back and watched the fray. It has gone right to the front where the battle is fought and has offered hope and comfort to those who got the worst of it. Rome knows humanity so well. It has forgiven so many sins through so many centuries. It has heard the confessions of kings and peasants and mountebanks, and it knows so well how wicked and miserable humanity really is. It has been cruel, but it has been tender. It has deceived, but it has also comforted. And she insisted that many times that she was not using Catholicism just as a prop or as material. I do not regard the Roman Church merely as artistic material. It is the external form and ceremonial of that church. It happens to be more beautiful than those other churches. It certainly corresponds to some beautiful vision within. It is sacred for no other reason that it is the faith that has been most loved by human creatures and loved over the greatest stretch of centuries. So for Cather, Catholicism preserved, protected, and transmitted the highest and deepest of human values and realities. Her experiences in France definitely, helped that grow within her. It planted the seed and helped it grow within her as she apprehended that an integrated medieval mindset of order and meaning. In addition, she did find elements of Catholicism consoling, personally. When she lived in New York, she did attend an Episcopal church, but she also attended services at Catholic churches, particularly St. Vincent Ferrer on the Upper East Side, which was near her apartment. Her brother, one of her brothers died, and he lived in California. And she was not able to go to the funeral, but she wanted to go to church at the same time his funeral was happening. So that was 2 o'clock California time, 6 o'clock New York time. So she went out to look for a church to go into, to pray. I wanted to spend that hour in a church, but I was unable to find any Episcopalian church which would be open at that hour. They close at 6. So I went to the Church of the Dominican Fathers, which is only a few blocks from this house and where I've often gone for service. The Catholics seem to be the only people who realize that in this world, grief goes on all night as well as day, and they have a place for it to hide away and be quiet. Now, I think it's important to understand, too, that Cather had this sense and this appreciation, not just of Catholicism, but of indigenous religions, particularly of the people of the Southwest. If you've read The Professor's House, if you've read her story, The Enchanted Bluff, even if it comes into Death Comes for the Archbishop, a sense that the religion and the cultures of these people are unsullied. They are representative of before, okay? So she is... and this is just a quote that I really don't have time to read from The Professor's House. And it's a quote that's spoken by a priest who's considering looking at the mesa that is important in this part of the story, that is kind of based on Mesa Verde in Colorado. So she certainly has that kind of appreciation. But is there more? Is there something that she's missing? Yes, Cather's characters find comfort in their faith. They find strength, obviously, strength to go on, strength to sacrifice, as we see in Death Comes for the Archbishop. Her descriptions are beautifully, luminously sacramental. But there is something missing. And that is really, in most of her work, any kind of sense of an individual spiritual battle. The playing out of Genesis 1 through 11 in the gospel, right where those characters are. The confrontation with the reality of who we are as beautiful, broken creatures in need of the redemption that only the broken, beautiful, crucified one can give. And if you compare what most of Cather's experience in a Catholic context and compare it to, Pinky in Brighton Rock or any of Green's characters, Ruby Turpin in A Small Town in Georgia, Louis of Viper's Tangle, Lord Brideshead on his deathbed. It's a different kind of use of Catholicism. It's a different kind of apprehension of it. And this was noticed by a few critics. Most Catholic critics of her time were wildly and deservedly appreciative of what she was doing because, as she noted, no Catholics were doing it, at least in the United States. There was an American Catholic literature, but it was not anything that was sort of looking at and embracing the American Catholic experience in a literary kind of way. I just have time to highlight one piece, though, that was written, and it's a very good piece, and it might, I don't know, he appreciates Cather, but he's a little harsh about this aspect of her, but I think it's worth considering. So it's a piece that originally appeared in 1951 in America magazine and then became part of a collection of, in this book, 50 Years of the American Novel, 1900 to 1950, which I highly recommend. It's a collection, it was published by Scribner, but it's a collection of essays on American novelists from, Faulkner, Hemingway, Cather, Wharton, by Catholics. And it's available on archive.org, which is mercifully back up and running now. And this issue of America is on there too, but I highly recommend it. And this essay is written by Francis X. Connolly, who was a notable and a stalwart of the Fordham English department. He got all of his degrees from Fordham, and he was there as a professor for a long time. And he wrote this essay on Cather, in which he said, her idea of Christianity was perhaps too aesthetic, too historical, too French, an admiration of Christian art and manners, its order and decency, its culture and codes. She tried to remember what she had not experienced, and perhaps found that her response, and this is that of the culturally starved Protestant, to the greatness of the past, her noble desire to participate in an aristocracy of spirit, did not suffice to capture the reality she aimed at. And, views on this question can differ. I mean, there's certainly within her work, characters, and if you think about Death Comes for the Archbishop, Bishop Latour and his vicar they struggle, they suffer. But as he points out in this essay, it is not so much an internal struggle as we find in, and that we know personally as the spiritual struggle that any of us go through. But it's conducted on a level in which we have saints and sinners, and never the twain shall meet, basically. The saints do struggle, but there is no sense that we are all saints and sinners. And the struggle, any struggle with evil comes from without in Cather for the most part, with one exception, which I don't have time to talk about, which is My Mortal Enemy, which I think is her most complex work. It's short, it's a novella, it's complex, and it was written right before Death Comes for the Archbishop, and in it she does have a character who has to confront her own sinfulness in a very profound way at the end of her life. And she doesn't do anything like this in her fiction anywhere else. So what Connolly ends up by saying is, again, it may come off as a harsh assessment, but I don't think so. I read Death Comes to the Archbishop and some of her other work years ago, reread a lot of it this summer, and then just last weekend I reread Death Comes for the Archbishop, for the fourth or fifth time, and I have to say, after doing all this work, it did hit different. It did hit different. And he wrote, as he ended his piece, he said, had she been able to see that Death Comes for the Archbishop and Shadows on the Rock were themselves incomplete, that there were still higher levels of spiritual values and greater depths of spiritual suffering, had she been less content with her ideas of things and with the ascetic gratification of those ideas, had she, in other words, felt fire as well as seen it, she might have been the greatest novelist of our time. Thank you.
Thank you for three such wonderful and intriguing and interesting and enriching papers, and I know we'll have lots of questions. So I do think we have some time, and I'll give you a minute to gather your thoughts, and then we'll take some questions. We do have microphones here that you can share so everyone can hear you, and I see a question in the back. No, you can if you project your voice, I think we can hear you. Yes. Which one? We have two Amy's.
Welborn. Okay. Cather, as I listen to you briefly describe Willa Cather, her independence, her strong personality, and the pictures that struck me, I think, as an eccentric type, but especially as you described her going to different churches and what she said of the Catholic Church, she reminded me a little bit of Jean Brodie in the fiction and of what Muriel Sparks said of her, that although she didn't know it, or maybe she denied it, she was a Catholic of sorts. Would you care to comment on that?
Amy, could you pass the microphone?
Yeah, sure. I don't know. I mean, I think that she was a person who was very educated, and she, educated in that way that late 19th century people were educated. She knew her Bible. She knew the traditional Christian creeds. And I think she had, whatever her experience of Catholicism with, she had made her choice and made her decision that it wasn't for her for whatever reason. So she definitely had a sacramental vision. She definitely had an appreciation for Catholicism. When you read her journalism and she takes on evangelical preachers and those kinds of more low church things, you can see her almost contempt for them. And so it is, you wonder sometimes if it is an aesthetic kind of appeal to her. I don't think so. I think there is an aesthetic appeal, there's a nostalgic appeal of Catholicism, but that it's both, but it's more. But at the same time, for whatever reason, that she could not enter into whatever the actual, the real demands of being a disciple within Catholicism are. So, yeah.
Other questions? Yes, right here.
Thank you, everyone. My question is for Dr. Fahey. You mentioned the cloak. I was just wondering, you said there were maybe 2 other symbols that are recurrent throughout Christian love and Satire. I wondered if you could raise the flag and point us towards both those.
Well, there are 2 other moments early on where the cloak becomes a potent symbol or emblem. There are, there are many others throughout the novel, and especially the. I feel like I'll give a lot away if I mention too many, but certainly with Njal Saga. The endings of both of those works are pretty. If you've read Kristen Lavensdatter, so the snow, and there are the use of laughter. So Skarpedin is the character in Njal Saga who always laughs, and the meaning behind that laughter is very similar to the kind of laughter of Erlend. Erlend is the Skarpedin character in Njal Saga. There's Hallgerda is the bad girl in Njal Saga. She's the means of much killing because of her just her nature and her slander. And Kristen has her Hallgerda moments. Kristen's memory, Kristen's inability to forget. Kristen's memory is a beautiful thing in the novel. It's what preserves her, but when it's operating correctly, when it's not, it's what it is for most women. It's yes, and the moment in Njal Saga where Gunnar is about to be killed, and the only thing that will save him is a bowstring. He has to restring his bow, and he wants a hair of Hallgerda's, and she says, what is it worth to you? And he says, nothing less than my life. And she says, then I'll remember that slap you gave me. And when Kristen says, I'll never forget, this is how you greeted your son. There's a whole host of ways in which the novel is replaying some of those moments from Njal Saga, but she's commenting on them as she's doing them. She's I don't want to say she's baptizing them or redeeming them, but she's ultimately she's taking from that love song and presenting us with its fulfillment in a way that the Norse are unable to. They just behind that wall is doom. And she sees it differently. And it's remarkable because, she's not Catholic when she's writing Kristen Lavensdatter. It's sort of like, Willa Cather. Everybody thinks, oh, she converted and then she writes this amazing, Catholic novel. No, she's completed it before she converts. So.
I think we may have time for one more question. Yes, right.
Hi, my question's for Dr. Fahey. You mentioned at one point that Willa, Cather, and Sigrid and Undset knew each other and were friends. Could you speak a little bit about how they met and the nature of their relationship?
Yes, so it's very beautiful, and so they corresponded. Cather, Undset was an admirer of Cather's fiction. In fact, the only work of Cather's that was translated into Norwegian, she was translated into Swedish early on, like most of her novels, but was Lucy Gayhart. Her Sigrid Undset's sister translated that, her sister Signe. And for a long time, Cather wasn't available in Norway. There just simply weren't any translations. Sigrid Undset, but it was primarily when Sigrid Undset when she fled Norway in 1947 with the Nazi invasion, and earlier, 1941. She went back in 1947. But when she fled, and she lived in the Hotel Margaret in New York, in sort of a Norwegian section of New York, and she became an apologist for the Allies for the next several years. She really didn't write any fiction after that. And she visited Cather not in the Bay of Fundy, but she visited her in Oneida, New York. And she was also friends with Marjorie Kinnans Rawling, who wrote The Yearling. So she had quite an extensive literary friendship, but it was a very deep friendship rooted in their, I have to say that the chief shared love was of flowers and birds. And she, when she went back to Norway, she brought with her her American garden of seeds. The only thing that really took from Willa Cather were the black-eyed Susans. She really wanted the dogwoods, but it just didn't take. And one of the most beautiful letters is, the Nazis used her home, Björkjebæk, as a brothel. They burned the desks that her father had made her. They burned her bookshelves. But friends of hers had taken some of her books and belongings and stored them in a church basement. And as she was unpacking them, she came across her photograph of Willa Cather. And she writes to Willa Cather and says, it's, bruised, it's bent up, but it was all the more dear to me. And shortly after, Cather preceded her in death, and she wrote a beautiful tribute assessing, Cather's literary stature, but also noting their very deep friendship.
Well, we are out of time, but please feel free to come forward and ask questions as this session's ended. Thank you.